Since the beginning of hip hop, I feel like the majority of MCs and rappers have always strived for a classic album. It's kind of like the NBA ring of hip hop in the sense that everyone tries to achieve it, but very few can. And that term kind of gets thrown around too loosely nowadays.
Facts.
But we're actually going to talk on this episode about the last classic rap album that has dropped and kind of what it takes to drop a classic rap album nowadays. So what's interesting is that our Patreon supporters actually chose this episode. So we made you guys vote on 3 different options for what the episode today would be. So we had TDE's rollouts for 2021, we had Griselda's takeover, and we had what's the last classic rap album that has dropped. And that was the winning vote, guys. So to all the Patreon supporters, thank you. And if you guys want to have a say in our episodes and choosing the content for them, the link to our Patreon is in the description and you can have your say next week.
Absolutely. Shout out to the Patreon members, because this was a super cool concept, because I feel as if it's something that, not only a lot of people online talk about, but also within our videos. So, when you're kind of going through it, it's like, what constitutes that, that classic album? And guys, listen, leave your take for, what was the last classic album that we've gotten, because, there's a lot in contention. Obviously, it's subjective, at least in my opinion.
You think it's subjective, really?
I think there's subjective, but there's definitely guidelines. Like, I think you definitely have to have a cutoff with the time that it was released.
I think time is the biggest factor. When you're talking about a classic album,
I think there's time, but there's also different things that go into it, though, that are equally as important, though.
Look, you said it's subjective, which, look, to me, if you want to rate an album, a perfect score, if you want to call it a masterpiece, to me, that's subjective. But certain classic albums are certified classics. If you look at Reasonable Doubt, Ready to Die, Illmatic, how could you kind of debate against those albums being classics?
But I'm talking about more or less like, some people might, call a certain album a classic, and some people might say no. So at the end of the day, like, who's right or wrong in that situation?
So for you, what does it take to drop a classic album?
Well, at least like the first thing I look at for is like quality within the track list. Like, there cannot be a single skip.
Yeah.
Like, the track list has to be so tight and so coherent that you go from start to finish, and it's just a perfect listen all around. That's the biggest thing for me, because quality is really what drives everything else. It'll drive the longevity of the album. Not only that, but it'll drive the impact of the album. And going into the impact and the influence, how did it affect not only the genre, but maybe, pop culture? How did it, sort of influence other rappers?
How iconic is it? And honestly, for me, it's more like, will this project be played and will it be remembered in years to come? You know what I mean? I mean, if you look at Illmatic, if you look at Ready to Die, if you look at all of these classics, The Blueprint, etc., Doggy Style, these are all part of today's culture and era. And to me, the biggest thing is kind of trying to redefine the genre, trying to have an influence on other artists, and also just the strength and the longevity that project had. Is that content matter still relevant? Does it still speak to and sound as crisp as it did 20 years ago?
Absolutely.
Today? It's the same way when you look at classic cars, right? You can't call a car a classic after it's only been out for 2 years. So it's interesting, though, because if you look at, kind of certain albums and certain artists, Drake, for example, on the song Hype from Views, he has the bar where he says, Views is already a classic. So do you feel like, because a lot of artists do this, where they kind of call their albums classics right as soon as they come out or before they even come out. So is that kind of just a marketing tactic for you, or is it?
Well, I mean, if you think about the amount the amount of confidence someone like Drake has, I mean, he's obviously going to call his shit a classic before it comes out. You have to have that type of swagger and that type of, cadence and confidence going into your album, or else it probably is going to come out, half-assed. But the thing is that if I look at the timeline, because I think that's where we're going to start with this, I know you have your 5-year rule, and you've often mentioned it, like, you need 5 years. I agree with the 5-year. I think 5-year, it's 100% that you could call something a classic. To me, that's
at the minimum. And honestly, if someone wants to tell me 10 years, I'd be totally fine with that. And I'll give an answer for both the 5-year and for the 10-year.
I'm on my 3-year.
By the way, guys,
I like 3 years.
Okay, that's fine. Before we get into it, I want to actually read out the actual Oxford Dictionary definition of what a classic is. And it reads, judged over a period of time, which is key, to be of the highest quality and outstanding of its kind. So we're actually going to get into some of the comments that you guys had dropped for what you think the last classic album we received was. And we put it out this on the community tab a couple of weeks ago. So it's interesting to see your takes. But something else I want to discuss too is that, like, back in the 90s, for example, a lot of people kind of looked at critical reception to see what they were going to deem as classics, and they related to the Source magazine,
with the CD markings, right?
The 5 mic ratings. Absolutely. And an album like Illmatic, for example, did receive a 5 mic rating before it was even out. So to me, that was them knowing that it was an instant masterpiece.
Mm-hmm.
But to call it a classic before it's out, before it's had time to age, to me, you can't do that. And it's the same thing that Diddy did when Daytona came out. You know, he had a video out. He said, I listened to this album multiple times. I'm trying to look for a flaw. I can't find the flaw. It's an instant classic. Is it a masterpiece, Daytona? Yes, it is. Maybe not a classic just yet because it hasn't had the time. But anyways, let's get into the actual comments from the viewers.
Let's do it. Let's see what they got going on.
I want to hear your takes on this, man.
All right. I'm gonna put this up on my phone. Yeah, I saw some interesting ones.
To Pimp a Butterfly, I think that that definitely is a certified classic. One of the greatest hip hop albums of all time, and the social impact has gone beyond the bounds of music and is still relevant today and so important. I think for everybody to hear, hip hop fan or not.
This got 29 likes by our friend John. He said, Bandana, some rap songs, Kids See Ghosts, Igor, Alfredo, Care For Me, and a few others. The 2010s had classics picks all throughout the decade. My only problem with a lot of this is that it's a bit too short. The only one, Kids See Ghosts is the one that I think makes my 3-year rule, especially maybe even some rap songs came out in 2018, correct? So,
yeah.
Okay, Bandana. You see, that was one thing that I was going to mention in this episode, but I kind of excluded it because the 2 years is a bit short notice. It's definitely not ideal to call something a classic after 2 years. But I think having 3 years, that rule of 3 for me, is substantial because if you look at the type of quality that came out in 2018, and I think that's somewhere where we could start is there's albums in that year that I could call classics for me, shit that's
too
lasted
soon,
over it.
It's just too soon.
So what would make 2018 too soon? What does that 2 year difference between the 5 and the 3 make for you?
It makes a huge difference, man. Time is everything. Like I said, I mean, if you want to judge an album on a classic, like someone said, actually more than one person said, and shout out to you guys for showing love to J.Cole's The Off Season, but a lot of people in the comment section mentioned The Off Season, and when I heard that, I'm like, look, man, it's only been about a month at this point. And an album to me will age differently after my first listen, after 2 listens, after 2 months, after 2 years, after 4 years. So to call an album a classic after just 3 years, to me, it's still too soon. And 5 years really is the bare minimum because I got to see half of a decade. I kind of got to see, is there an influence picking up? Did it do something drastic to kind of change the landscape of hip hop? Okay. And to me, there's definitely masterpieces and there's future classics that have dropped in 2018, and there's actually quite a few of them. But to me, it just hasn't gotten to a point in time yet where I can call it a certified classic. Just to run through a few more of these. Astroworld has been a popular response. Once again, great album, too soon for me. What else do we have? Someone said The Sun's Tirade. That's a decent pick. That's a pretty good pick. And yeah, a lot of answers from saying T-Pab. So
that's interesting because I like what you had said about the half a decade. But let's say if you look at your timeline for an album ages for you, that year 4 and 5. Okay, you need those extra 2 years to be able to do it. What do you necessarily find in an album in that 4 or 5 that you couldn't find within those 3 years?
Like I said, man, it's more time. It's the extra 2 years to really see. Okay, now we're at the halfway point in the decade. Is this album as iconic to the culture? Is it still being played, all around by hip hop fans? And 2 years is a lot, man. That's a lot of time. That's almost as much time as you would give just to call it a classic. So it's almost double the amount of time, and we get to really see the impact of it on a bigger scale with time.
I know, but if you're already calling it a future classic, is it not already a classic?
No, because it could die off of not just me, but off of everybody.
Okay, so it's been a scenario where you've done that, where you've been like, okay, this is a future classic, and it's ended up dying off for you.
Yeah.
No, but what's an example?
What's an example of that?
That's happened to you with that.
Let me try to think. I would say maybe some rap songs by Earl Sweatshirt.
You think so?
When I first heard it, I was really stunned by it, by kind of the rawness of it, and also the instrumentation that Earl was using. But the more and more that I hear about it, his older projects seem to have more kind of weight and seem to be talked about more and seem to have influenced other artists in the process. So there's definitely been examples. That's just one of the ones I can think of off the top of my head, but I really need that 5 years. But anyways, we were talking about Bandana before, which is a good example of this because it came out 2 years ago. I think that it maybe is a masterpiece, or at least very close to it. I mean, also, if you look at the production, it feels like it's the soundtrack to a 70s blaxploitation film. I mean, from the raw samples, from the Japanese abstract samples, from Madlib, and also the fact that Madlib actually, gave those beats to Freddie, I think in about 2016, so 2 years after Piñata, and this was around the same time that Freddie was in jail in Austria. And apparently, what he did is that he played those Madlib beats over and over again, and he memorized them in his head. So while he was in his jail cell, he thought to himself, like, this next album, if I even get out of this jail cell, might be my last album. So what he did is that he wrote the whole album and thought about the flows all into his head. So he memorized it in his brain, and he's like, I have to rap like this is going to be my last album. And that's what it felt like on Bandana. You got some of his best rapping ever, and a lot of crazy content about, institutionalization and just, police brutality and important social matters. So to me, it has the makings of a future classic, but just hasn't had the time yet.
Yeah, it's definitely a situation where it hasn't had the time yet. Like 2 years is way too soon to call it. I'll have to see next year if it continues being in my rotation, which I definitely do think it will be. Like this is something that I could almost guarantee to be a classic in the future. Like I'm a bit more lenient on my timeline because I feel as if like
that's the thing is everyone's too lenient on the timeline. Everyone's too lenient on the quality that's needed. I mean, you have to be like me.
Am I being lenient with Daytona calling it a classic? Is that lenient to you?
No, because it's a perfect album. But it's not a classic yet. It's not a classic yet.
I'm lenient with the timeline because things like Bandana and Daytona are almost near perfect albums for me. So yes, I could constitute that.
But that's not the only thing that certifies an album as a classic. Is it being a perfect
definitely
album?
Not. But I do have I feel as if in my own personal experience in listening that I could strongly say, okay, this is going to be good for me after that 3 years. Like if it's made the 3 year mark for me, it'd probably end up making the 5 year mark for me. Like that's at least where I'm at with my shit. Like for me to go and not call let's say, even Swimming by Mac Miller a classic, like that's something I feel as if a lot of people sleep on. Like that was another near flawless album that really did its thing. Kids See Ghosts and what that did for the culture and how that reunited Kid Cudi and Kanye
and brought it to another scale with the whole mental health content.
So that's
that
what
was
I'm trying
important.
to say is like obviously the time is the most important factor into it. It's just like if I need to wait for a title for the amount of years that it needs for me to call it a classic, then.
But maybe something in 2021 comes along that's tackling, let's say, the same topics and themes as Kids See Ghosts, but does it in a more innovative way, takes more risks, and maybe that in 10 years from now ends up being the classic rather than the other project that you thought was after 2 to 3 years, but ends up kind of dying down. I know, but then is replaced.
I'll counter you with the argument. Then didn't Kids See Ghosts then influence that album?
Potentially, it depends, man.
No, that was the basis.
But every album is influenced from something else, though.
But that's what I'm trying to say is like if that's the case, then KSG was the album that maybe formed that album and that birthed that whole spawn of music. So that's what I'm trying to say is like there's a lot of shoulda, woulda, couldas in these types of situations. For myself, well, that's it. It's like right now, like there's really nothing telling me that KSG is not going to age as a classic, or the same thing for Astroworld.
It looks like it'll Daytona. Age as a classic, but right now I can't give it that label of a classic album.
Yeah,
just yet.
Okay, so then what would you say happens? Like what?
It's
what
time, man. It's time.
What wouldn't constitute it?
It's time. It's all about time, man. If that project kind of dies down, if people aren't listening to it like that anymore, if it doesn't have, let's say, the impact that we thought it had, if it doesn't start influencing other artists to, be inspired from that project, there's a lot of factors that go into it, but it's a good debate. Obviously, we stand on two different sides of it.
I get you, but also, like, let's say, look at the Astroworld situation. Like, look how much that's done for pop culture and, like, what it's done in 3 years. That album has done more in 3 years than a lot of other albums have done in, let's say, 10. So then that's like, okay, where do you weigh it? Like, where do you put it? So something like Astroworld, where it literally, blew up pop culture and Travis Scott literally exploded hip-hop to a whole different level with that one album.
Blowing up pop culture isn't anything to me because, obviously, a lot of albums that come out...
I don't know about that, brother.
Can I talk? So a lot of albums that come out in their time are obviously going to be relevant to that time, but is the content enough? Like, are those pop culture references going to be relatable in 10 years from now?
I don't know.
That's the question, man.
You ask me how many people how many people have touched that album and how many people have heard that album. Like that alone, like
it's
really
not a classic yet.
Really
hasn't had enough time yet for me.
So what?
I'm sure people were calling Birds in the Trap, Sing McKnight a classic in its time. I don't think it's gonna be a classic.
But like, regardless, like, isn't Astroworld your favorite Travis Scott album?
Doesn't mean it's a classic.
Yeah,
I would.
But you put it over Rodeo. Is Rodeo a classic then?
Rodeo's a classic. It's had the time.
So it's over that.
It's a classic trap album.
So then
it's
for
not
you,
over
so
it.
then
No,
ultimately,
it's not about quality. A masterpiece is different from a classic album. An album can be at the highest caliber that it could be. I don't know about
that, brother.
Some people are calling The Off-Season a masterpiece. Would you be familiar calling it a classic? Would
Absolutely
you be okay
not.
with that?
It's not a masterpiece.
It's not a masterpiece. I agree, but I'm saying if fucking Tyler's album ends up being a masterpiece, are you okay with calling it a classic album a week after release?
I told you I have my 3-year rule. Absolutely.
All right. Anyways, so my most recent classic album, because we're never gonna finish with this debate, guys. Settle it for us in the comments because getting a little bit heated here. But my pick would probably have to be The Life of Pablo, which does fit into my 5-year rule. And I love what Kanye did here, man. He innovated the game by kind of changing the norms of how to release an album. If you look at how he had 2 different titles for it beforehand, you know, he had Swish and Waves, and then a couple of days before the release, he changed it to The Life of Pablo. And then if you look at the album cover, which, you know, totally tells the story of what the album is, you have the picture of the family gathering, then you have the girl in the bikini, and you have The Life of Pablo written underneath. You have Which One, and that whole thing is like Kanye's at a crossroads. He has to choose between, now that he's a father and a family man, will he stick to that life or will he go to kind of his vices and where he felt comfortable in a life of excess, of luxury, of, you know, being obsessed with women, all that sort of stuff. So that was beautifully represented throughout the album. And not only that, but the whole idea of the 3 Pablos, right? You have Paul the Apostle, who, of course, Paul in Spanish is Pablo, right? And that's the whole thing of how, you know, Paul the Apostle was the biggest mover of message, right? Because he wrote multiple books in the New Testament, and he was one of the biggest, I would say, influencers in Christianity. So that's how Kanye feels like he's now pushing his own Christian beliefs into the world. Then you have Pablo Escobar, who was the biggest mover of product. And that's maybe where Kanye sees himself as being the biggest mover of music, of shoes, of just overall consumerism. And then you have, of course, Pablo Picasso, the biggest mover of art. And that's what Kanye is giving us on this album, man. It's pure art. To me, let me ask you this. Do you feel like this is Kanye taking musically a new direction, or do you feel like it's more of a culmination of all of his projects?
Very interesting question. I would say it's definitely his most diverse track list because, you know, you're getting so many different sounds, like, you know, the college dropout, you know, late registration, graduation, even somewhat of MBDTF, even 808s and
could
Heartbreak.
Be heard in this album, right?
It could be heard in this album, but I feel as if like they had very consistent sounds and like it sounded very, you know, sonically pleasing. I feel as if like the listens were consistent
sound,
exactly.
Right? Yeah.
Even Yeezus, like, you know, but once you got to The Life of Pablo, like, there was so many different sounds, and not only that, but look at the feature list. Like, look how many different artists you're getting on that track list, and like, that obviously has a huge impact to play in the overall listen of it. So, yes, I do think it is one of his most diverse projects to date, and a reason why I would call it a classic even more, regardless of the beautiful quality of it, because it's a fantastic project. It's like, it's in like a 9, like, well, it's really up there for me, like, to becoming a perfect album.
I think it's a top 5 Kanye album. And also the fact that he was making...
Oh, you'd put it a top 5 Kanye album?
I think so. And we'll probably do a video on our discography of Kanye's albums at one point. But to me, it's also the fact of how he defined the album as a changing, breathing, artistic expression. And that's because he was making updates to this album as it was already released. And that was groundbreaking because... why should art ever be stagnant? Why should it always be, you know, one product that never changes? Kanye created something that was changing and that was evolving, and that he had the balls to say, okay, let me add Saint Pablo to this.
No,
like weeks after it was released, and it ends up being probably his best outro and one of his most introspective songs ever. Then you have him changing some of Chance the Rapper's bars, and it's just the way that he packaged this, the way that he rolled it out. Just so many iconic moments. Think about the beat drop on Father Stretch My Hands Part 1. Think about the moment when they were at the Madison Square Garden previewing that song, man. Everybody has that video, that picture of Kid Cudi and Kanye embracing, you know, vibing out to that song. And to me, when you add in how an album is iconic, when you add in the strength of it, how it's an artistic expression, and just how it changed the kind of the landscape of hip-hop forever, to me, that's really something that constitutes a classic.
That's a great explanation. I definitely got to say that it is a classic. Like, that's no debate. It's definitely something that stick through my rotation for such a long time. It still is in my rotation. Definitely one of the most replayable Kanye albums.
Will it be Kanye's last classic?
I don't know. Definitely, I don't know. Like, he could do anything he wants, but like, that's such a far question to ask. It's kind of like, when is he going to drop his next album, and then how long after are we going to be able to call it a classic? But if I have to go with my choice, I'm going to advance 2 years on you, and I'm going to put Daytona in there. Listen, if I have to think about probably the best gangsta album that came out in the past 10 years, it's probably Daytona, and I don't think it's a debate with anything. I mean, just having 7 tracks on that album was just such a great decision, and it's such a smart move. Especially Pusha T said that he had to completely change the album weeks before the album actually came out because Kanye had heard it, and there were so many different things that he wanted to put into it. The whole thing with was it Janet Jackson? No, I believe it was Whitney Houston's bathroom.
The album cover.
Yeah, the whole album
actually,
cover.
Speaking of that, something I want to ask you is that do you think the album cover is important when thinking about a classic album?
Absolutely, because it gives you a visual to the music, right? And like, that's what I think about it. Like, I don't know why it makes I don't know why it works so well with Daytona, but it does. Like, I believe it was also supposed to be called King Push, right? Before
it was originally supposed to be called that.
Even like the whole Daytona vibe, like, it sticks with you. It has the ring to it. But I mean, when it comes down to music, when you're able to carry such a short project and give so much detailed explanation and so much imagery, through coke stories and through these witty punchlines and through one of the best deliveries and flows that I've ever heard of in all time through Pusha T. It's absolutely beautiful. Mix that in with Kanye's sampling and the way that had like a coherent vibe to it throughout the whole track list. It was fantastic. Not only that, but in recent time, I can't really think of another album, if I had to put it next to Daytona, that compares to the one from the start to finish listen. Like, there's so much shit that goes in from that 1 to 7 that you could play it in the car and it's a perfect car ride.
So accessible, man.
So not all of that considered, I also think that it did a major part in bringing in the underground scene. I mean, if you look at the amount of attention that Pusha T had gotten from that run back in 2018, think about what that maybe did for other acts such as Griselda. Think about what that did for, let's say, Freddie Gibbs. Like, just being able to open up the waters for a lot of these coke rappers and a lot of these underground rappers to come in and put in their material to people that have that similar interest to Pusha T. And even at that, like, Freddie Gibbs has admitted that when Pusha had gotten, I believe it was the Grammy nomination, correct?
I think it was Complex naming him
rapper of the year.
Best rapper alive, I think it was.
Was it alive or of the year?
I think alive.
Because I think they do it every year or so?
Yeah, they do every year, best rapper alive. Yeah.
Okay, so
rapper of the year, you could say.
Okay, we'll call it rapper of the year. When he had heard that and saw the influence of Daytona, it motivated him to go harder and start releasing better projects. And I mean, if you look at what that Pusha T album did after for the whole landscape of underground hip hop, it's absolutely beautiful. Because think about it, you don't have that album. Think about the type of albums that possibly change after Daytona dropped just because of the different listenership, maybe the amount of attention that the scene is getting, and also the way maybe Pusha T is going to be coming with his next album. And
it was also one of the most popular coke rap albums that we've gotten in recent time. I mean, obviously, it kind of got that extra push from the whole Drake feud, but nonetheless, I think it sold like 60,000 copies first week, which is actually pretty fucking amazing for a coke rap album. And a lot of people were saying that when an album like Piñata came out in 2014, that was the best coke rap album since the Clips days. And now I feel like more and more that Daytona is kind of now become the best coke rap album since the Clips days. So
Piñata,
Pusha T is now competing with 2 different eras of himself, him as a duo with No Malice, and now Pusha T himself. And the longevity this guy has had, if you even look at his work with Kanye, it's fucking masterful.
Yeah, that's another thing that gives me that future indication vibe. Like, even if I want to play the 5-year rule, like, bro, like I would put a fuckload of money that this project would end up, making that 5-year rule. So the thing is like, not only does Push's music have so much longevity, but the influence that it's done to the underground scene, the quality of the project, that moment of time hearing it for the first time, like, everything was super iconic about it. And, you go through that track list, man, you're not finding a single bad song. There's
100%.
There's no fucking way. Like, if you slam find their one song on Daytona, just like stop listening to my podcast, man. Like it's not worth it. But no, I'm fucking with you. But listen, like that's the thing is
flawless.
It's a flawless project. It's a fucking masterpiece. And Diddy had every right to call it that when he first heard it. Because think about it. Think about how many albums that guy has heard.
Yeah.
Think about how many fucking albums that guy has heard.
And how few he's called masterpieces and classics, for sure.
But when you go through that album, what are you going to find with it? Like, there's literally no reason not to call it a classic, in my opinion.
Diddy literally said, he's like, I listened to this album like 4 or 5 times over because when I first heard it, it sounded amazing, but I wasn't too sold on like, okay, is this really the one? And then he's like, okay, you know what? Now, now I'm going to be listening to this album to find the flaw. And he couldn't do it.
No, you can't.
You can't do it.
What are you gonna do? You're gonna try and critique Kanye's producing.
Even the features, man.
Like
Rick Ross, Kanye. I mean,
like, what are you gonna criticize? You're gonna criticize fucking Pusha T's flows and deliveries? Definitely not.
And some of the best conviction we've ever heard.
Absolutely.
I mean, the way that he brought in his own kind of language and lingo with with the Coke poetry. It's beautiful stuff. To me, it's a masterpiece. I still want to give it those extra 2 years. It will end up being a classic. It's not there yet for me.
Okay, so if it will be end up, could we call it a classic?
It's a future classic. That's what I'll call it, man. But let's say we were to play the game of having the 10-year rule. So albums from, let's say, 2011 and before. I think that one album that really stands out to me is actually Undone by the Roots. And that is
big facts.
That's one of the greatest concept albums I've ever heard because it's a story told in reverse, and the instrumentation, the live drums from Questlove and the rest of the members, and the fact that there's features such as Dice Raw and Big Crit on there, and they also take the first person perspective of the main character from that concept album. It was genius. One of the hardest hitting albums that I've heard maybe ever, and I think that that's a masterwork and a classic album. And I don't want to go too much in depth because
there's going to be spoilers.
I don't want to spoil kind of the main story of Undone by the Roots, but please check that out. If you love, kind of storytelling and concepts in hip hop albums, do yourselves a favor because that shit's timeless.
And also, like, go through the album from start to finish because it has a very big part to play in the overall listen of it.
It does. And if you also look at 2011, I mean, of course, you have Take Care. I think that could be established as a classic.
Absolutely.
Just because of how Drake changed the game. And
does DS2 and Rodeo get it for trap albums back in 2015?
I think DS2's there.
DS2's.
I mean, that's some of the most iconic trap songs of all time.
What that did to the culture was absolutely... It completely shifted the landscape of hip-hop. What that did for hip-hop was absolutely incredible. Even I would probably say Barter 6 as well. I think Barter 6 really pushed the boundaries of hip-hop as a whole. Like, if you think about how controversial that project was just for, like, not the fact that, Young Thug was doing stupid shit online, but more like, and he wasn't. I'm just throwing that out there. Like, if you look at what that music, what Barter 6 did musically and the way that it allowed different trap artists and artists as a whole to come out and express themselves and push the boundaries of their art and play with their vocals, play with the production, not to be boxed in by any sort of conformant or social sort of norms was absolutely fucking incredible. And then after that, then it's just like, what do those two trap albums do for the rest of the landscape of hip hop after that? Even something like Rodeo. I mean, that was the first time I've ever heard, psychedelic shit, mixed in and infused with, trap music, and the way that, it was kind of like, it was low key a concept album at the end of the day because it was, Travis Scott saying, yo, I'm here to play, and then kind of going through his life with it. And then every track has an important part to play within that trap list. So I think that was maybe one of the best years for trap as a whole.
It definitely was. And I actually want to ask you something. To you, is having a classic album or multiple classic albums, which of course is a very hard feat to achieve, is that the biggest accomplishment a hip hop artist or hip hop group could ever achieve?
Absolutely.
Is those classic albums?
Yeah, it's like a ring. Like you're getting your ring. You're cemented into hip hop history. Like, you've affected X amount of people over X amount of time, and you've done it in such a graceful way, and you've done it through creating such a masterpiece with vision and cadence. Like, that's what I think goes into that. And another
Yeah, but
another album that I want to shout out though is 444.
444 is definitely going to be a classic album.
I think that is
one more year. I give it one more year, and then I'll establish it the classic.
I think that's like an album we got to talk about being a classic, because if you look at the way Jay-Z was able to make a comeback and, you know, give us something so raw and emotional with, you know, no ID production and so many different factors into it.
How many artists could you say give you their most personal album 13 studio albums in? How many guys could you say that for,
Not only that, but I was reading an article where Jay-Z was talking about how many people hit him up just thanking him for saving their relationships.
Really?
Because
that's awesome.
I believe it was in the LeBron James interview. I can't remember what it's called off the top of my head, but I was reading an article off Complex, and it was like, yeah, I had so many artists and different people hit me up saying thank you for saving my relationship, because
that's so dope.
Think about it. Like, you see a Don like Jay-Z get so vulnerable and, you know, dive into his emotions and, you know, give so many different perspectives and ideologies into one, you know, again, another short listen. It's really fucking good, you know.
Short track lists are the way, man.
Short track lists are definitely the way.
T-Pab, I think, has like 15 songs, right?
Yeah, but it's still not over 20 songs, you know. Like that's
true.
But To Pimp a Butterfly is like, it's the
Marshall Mathers LP though. I think has about 20 songs.
20 songs, yeah, but that's Eminem. Like, but
some artists could do it. Also, It's Dark and Hell is Hot, I believe, is also around that same range of 19, 20 songs. So it's tougher when you have more of a track list, because you have to carry that energy and kind of that perfection for more time. But if you could pull it off, more power to you, because it's an even bigger accomplishment at that point.
So what do you think happens when artists try to drop classics nowadays? Because if I'm being honest with you, I don't feel as if we've gotten a classic in the past, like,
I just don't think that's the goal anymore.
Seasons.
I think that for most artists dropping now, in this new era, it's no longer the goal to achieve that classic status, because in their minds, if their fans fuck with it, it's kind of like we're redefining what a classic is. If their fans fuck with it, and if it puts up numbers and does, if it gives the impact that they want it to have, then for them, they did their job and it's a classic. But the problem is that in 10 years, a lot of the music that they're calling classics will not be remembered.
Absolutely. So example, like, look at Lil Baby's fan base. I guarantee you a lot of those Lil Baby fans are going to be calling My Turn a classic, and they're already doing it now. You know, do I think it'll stand the test of time? Maybe.
I don't know. Really don't know.
Maybe. I don't know. Like, listen, if DS2's lasted this long, like, think about what it's going to take.
Is that DS2 level, though?
Never. No, come on now. Don't even fucking ask me that. No, absolutely not. But that's the thing, is, like, it needs that time to go at it. But the thing, there is, like, a value to that answer to say My Turn could be a potential classic, because it's affected X amount of people. And if it continues to affect X amount of people in X amount of time, then fuck it. Like, it is to some people. Like, that's what I'm trying to say.
A lot of people are probably going to discredit me for this, but I feel like when I'm looking at a classic, like, content matter and like the messages, the themes within the music is also a very big factor when deciding a classic, because, I mean, that's the shit that lives on in history, man.
So what do you think got the pass for DS2? Because obviously it's not the most complex, subject matter of all time.
But you see, it's tough to say because
it's innovated.
It is innovative.
It has. I feel as if it has that innovation factor where you look at DS2 and then you look at what came after that. Then how Drake had to start diving into that lane for how popular that had become.
And the other thing too is that it's like
exploded.
Yeah, the other thing too is that it's like now that we have more subgenres in hip hop, it's like, okay, DS2 is easily a trap classic, but when we're 50 years down the line, will it be seen as an all-time classic? That's another question. Yeah, I don't know if I could answer that.
Yeah, there's so many things to call it about. But like, there's one thing that people definitely have to respect, and that's the old albums.
Oh, 100%.
The old classic. Like,
and why? Because they've had the time.
Absolutely. Like, take Reasonable Doubt, Illmatic, take Ready to Die, All Eyes on Me. There's so many, factors that have gone into it, and they've stood the test of time because, what is it? It's fucking like almost 3 decades more now. Like if you take Illmatic, it's gonna be almost 30 years in 3 years for
14. Yeah, it's almost 30 years.
It's almost 30 years that Illmatic is still be considered one of the best, if not the best hip hop album of all time. So whenever I hear people fucking discrediting old hip hop albums, like, listen, you don't have to like it. I don't think everyone has to, automatically buy into an album because of the name. But when you disrespect something that has so much longevity and that has influenced generations to come and that has birthed your favorite rapper,
that's that's when there's an issue.
You're out of your fucking mind, man. Come on now, stop. Like, people have to be also like, people have to be educated in the way that they respond to these questions, because like if you're just throwing albums out there, then it completely discredits the whole term of a classic. Like regardless, like example, me and you, we have that 3 to 5 year difference between us. Like that's what's separating our opinions.
Yeah.
But there's nothing changing on what we're calling it. Like, you know, ultimately you have to know what the album means to the culture.
100%.
You know what I'm trying to say?
100%. And I also think that, I mean, when we're looking at these albums, they have to really have stood the actual test of time. Like they have to sound as cohesive and as solid years down the road. So it's like, it bothers me that the term is just so loosely thrown around nowadays. I mean, if you want to call the album perfect, if you want to say that it's a masterwork, all this sort of stuff, I'm totally fine with that. But you can't give it that label, man. It's too tough to give it that label because that has to be merited over time. That's really what it comes down to for me.
Okay, so now let's fast forward a year from now. We'll play a bit of the time game. We'll fast forward a year from now. We'll go back to 2017.
Which albums out of 2017?
What do you think makes the cut? What do you think makes the filter?
Definitely 444 by Jay-Z. I think that's a lock. Easily the easiest lock out of all those albums. Damn by Kendrick Lamar is probably going to get the lock for me as well. I think that at least as a trap album, I think Culture is going to get the lock for me too.
Forever is a Mighty Long Time as well is probably going to get that for me.
Flower Boy potentially.
Yes, there's a lot of great fucking albums that have came out in that year. Like, especially when it comes to quality. Like, I feel as if less on the impactful side. Like, maybe like things were lacking on that end. But even at that, like, I feel as if the 2 most impactful albums, or maybe 3 of that year, were 444, Damn, and Culture. Those would probably have to be like my most impactful albums of the year.
I mean, at one point, I want to kind of maybe make an episode or video on who are really the kings of creating these masterpieces and these classic albums. And I mean, first thing that comes to my mind is Outkast.
Yeah,
if you look at their 3-album run and just their discography as a whole, I mean, they really did that back to back, man. Look at Stankonia, look at Aquemini, look at AT Aliens. I mean, it's flawless project one after the other, and the amount of artists in today's generation that we've seen be influenced by them and their Southern style, and just what they've put out, that's shit that has stood the test of time and will for decades to come, and that should kind of be looked at as the standard for what a classic album should be. Just take a dive into Outkast's discography.
I would say also Jay-Z. Jay-Z has a lot of fucking classics. Like I would say honestly, Jay-Z has 4 classics in my opinion. I would say Reasonable Doubt is cemented. I would say The Blueprint is cemented.
The Black Album
is cemented, and obviously
444 will be
and listen,
cemented.
in my books it's cemented, but you need your year to say it, so I would give my 4 to there.
That's fair.
The thing is that with Jay-Z's music is like, you could see the influence years after. Like, he literally laid down the whole blueprint for people. Like, he was, you know, it was beyond the music. It was how to create a future for yourself regardless of the passion or the hobby that you're in. You know what I'm trying to say? Like, it motivated so many people on a different social level that, you know, how could you not call his music some of the most timeless shit of all time? And then you look at the production quality, you look at the different types of, you know, things he brought into his music that had changed and revolutionized the game. Like, he literally did Biggie's work, in my opinion. Like, if you ask me, like, I think if Biggie would have stood that, you know, would have been able
that's
to...
That's where Biggie would have evolved to. It's kind of
like
that mogul talk and kind of giving guidance to generational wealth and how to build... build businesses and that sort of stuff.
Absolutely, yeah? I think so, because you saw it. Like, he was starting to do it already. Like,
true, that's facts.
And not only that, but Jay-Z has admitted on several occasions that there's no one that could really touch Biggie Smalls'
There's
music.
no Jay-Z if there's no Notorious B.I.G.
Absolutely.
That's what it comes down
like,
to.
he was literally the one that created that dawn factor. Like, you know, I'm going to come in and I'm going to show people that you could really do this and start from nothing. And, you know, there was really no one doing it like that. Like, obviously, there was different acts that had started diving into that sort of subject matter, but to really create whole rounded albums around that, I can't really think of anyone that's more memorable than, you know, Jay-Z or Biggie.
I agree. And I want to end this off by asking you, like, based on what we've heard so far this year, is there anything at all that you think even has a chance of one day being on that classic level? To me, the answer is no.
No, I don't think so.
And honestly,
I don't think so.
Even looking at 2020, I mean, maybe Alfredo, maybe Burden of Proof, but even at that, I don't know. To me, it's not looking like it right now.
No, that's the thing is, like, as we said before, the landscape of hip hop is changing. It's like there's more and more people getting into it. So the term classic has been, developed into different definitions, and so many people have opposing views to what a classic is. But at the end of the day, like, as long as people are enjoying the music, it's always fun to talk about it because it's always a great conversation. Thank you for watching the video. It's always a pleasure doing content for you guys. Listen, if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel because we're doing album reviews, and we actually have our series called Everything We Know, where we take you guys through the whole album rollout of the hottest releases of the year. Not only that, guys, but our Patreon plan is now live. You guys can access that in the bio. I appreciate you guys, and I'll see you on the next one.